Diolch, David, and I'd like to thank you, David, in addition to Neil Cuthbert and to Confo for their tremendous work in putting on a really great series of meetings over the last year. Now, today's topic builds on the previous meetings, which have discussed the vital need to link up tree planting, woodland management, and enhanced use of timber. And the topic we discussed last time being the huge potential to use more wood and the enormous benefits that using more wood can deliver. Now, at the last meeting, Baroness Young urged us to take up the challenge to grow more productive hardwoods, and Confo CEO Stuart Goodall promised to take up the challenge. So today, we're asking the deceptively simple question, should the UK set ambitious plans for producing more wood? We'll be moving away from binary discussions and looking at how we can develop high-volume softwood markets in tandem with smaller but higher value markets for hardwoods and slower growing softwoods. How can we do both and deliver a range of economic and environmental benefits? And later we'll hear from Tom Barnes of Aston Timber and Baroness Young, but first I'll hand over to Stuart Goodall, Confo CEO.
Thanks very much for that, Ben, and add my thanks for all your fantastic service over the last year chairing the meeting. It's been great having somebody that we can work with so constructively, and also, of course, to the other parliamentarians who participated in the meetings that we've had over the last year. I'm just going to share my screen now. Hopefully that will all work. If you just give me a second. All right. So let's look to share. There we go. Hopefully people can see that.
Yeah, it's just coming up now, Stuart. Yep.
Right, it's just taking a little bit of time to do that. Realize that I have set it up on the last slide. So there you go. It wasn't the quickest presentation ever. I'll now go through it. So wood, what's the issue? I mean, quite simply, the world wants wood. As economies grow, so does their wood consumption, both hardwood and softwood. And climate change concerns are accelerating this trend, given timber's positive carbon properties. Planting trees locks up carbon, wood holds that carbon in, and it's a low carbon product which can save carbon by displacing high carbon materials like steel, concrete, plastics, etc. Producing the wood in the UK offers wide-ranging benefits. In addition to those carbon benefits, rural jobs, income to manage the wood sustainably, and that income in then turn funds the continued provision of benefits such as biodiversity, which we've touched on in previous meetings. Now, we usually discuss softwoods and hardwoods separately, but in my presentation, leading into Tom's presentation, I'll set the scene by looking at the issue is in terms of market scale rather than specifically softwoods and hardwoods. So we've got volume markets, and these are softwood markets. That's what dominates in the UK, the rest of Europe, in fact, North America. Most of the wood that we consume is softwood. And those main markets are construction, fencing, pallets, and packaging. The last three of those, fencing, pallets, and packaging, were actually designated as essential products during the lockdowns that we've experienced. And the first of those, construction, is key in decarbonising our economy. England, UK softwood supply has grown in recent decades, and that's underpinned enormous growth in the wood processing sector across the UK, including England, since the 1980s. But as I'll come on to show, we're facing a timber gap from the 2030s. The softwood supply mainly comes from northern and western England, and also obviously in Scotland and Wales. Looking at those more niche markets, harder, slower growing softwood markets, these include bespoke markets, small scale housing, flooring and furniture, though actually the largest market is firewood. That's where we send most of the hardwoods that we grow in particular. And that kind of supply is more prevalent in southern and lowland in England, and similarly in parts of Wales and Scotland. And it's that market that Tom will focus on, and then we can pick up later in the PPG meeting. So I highlight the issue of the softwood gap. So as you can currently England produces approximately 4 million cubic meters of softwood per year. People appreciate that 4 million cubic meters doesn't necessarily mean a lot, but it is a big figure. The challenge we have is the forecasts, which are pretty accurate, demonstrate that that availability was going to drop significantly from the 2030s. So dark green, that's what we've got locked in terms of our production from existing forests. The little light start to see appearing over towards the right-hand side. That's where the new wood availability that we get from the planting that we've seen over the last 6 and 7 years, and it's not very much. Picture is replicated across the UK generally, so we're looking here at England, Scotland and Wales, and this is forecast of future wood availability, so softwood availability. And what that means is that just as global wood demand is rising, and we've heard in previous APPG meetings figures of 3-fold, 4-fold increases by 2050, 2060, we're actually going to be producing less wood in the UK. So far, only Scotland's taken action in recent years to increase planting significantly. The cause of that timber gap in an English context is very clear. So since the 1980s, planting has been overwhelmingly broadleaved, with little of that planted for wood production. The drivers have been more towards biodiversity, more towards water management matters, water quality. Very little of that is intended to be productive. All's not lost in terms of what's the future for wood supply. CONFOR's been calling for planting to rise to 7,500 hectares a year by 2025, 10,000 hectares a year by 2030. Now, by our calculations, even if only 25% of that planting, that new planting in England's high quality wood, we could double England's forecast wood production by the 2060s. And this is what we believe should be our target at least. So if you look at that diagram, essentially the greens are locked in planting. The little bit of green there, light green, is what we've planted so far in the last 6-7 years. And the larger sort of bluey green, depending on what colours appear on your screen, on the top, is what we could achieve when we start to deliver a certain proportion of this increased new planting as high quality softwood. Now, what does this mean in terms of planting on the ground? Just keen to answer concerns that people may have had in the past, that this is some sort of return to the 1980s and monoculture planting. This is a diagram of the planting that took place at Doddington in Northumberland. It was the largest productive forest planted in a generation in England. And as we can see from that, there's a real variety of species. There is landscaping to make sure that the tree planting that does take place fits well into the landscape, is attractive. We can see that there are areas which are productive and areas which are protected, and where we'll see real biodiversity and habitat benefits. It's also a site that will deliver significant public access opportunities as well. So really hitting on all elements of economy, environment, and people. And interestingly, there have been some on-site surveys before, obviously as part of the application process, and then last year, and observations have shown an increase in kestrel, barn owl, hen harrier, nightjar, owl butterfly, and petty whin. So already, even in just this very early stage, significant habitat biodiversity benefits are starting to be shown. So what next? Well, Tom's going to talk about hardwoods, slow-grown softwoods, but the key points I'd like to leave you with are, when talking about producing more wood and using more wood, we need to consider the wood and the trees in terms of the markets that we're working with. The majority of supply that we have and the markets that we sell into in the UK are volume softwood markets, so spruce, pine, larch, for example. If we're looking at hardwood, and as I said, Tom will say a lot more about this, the potential for hardwood, it's important to understand what that potential actually means. Hardwoods at the moment represent less than 8% of the wood we produce. And of this, over 80%, as I said, ends up as firewood. Now, this is not something that I want to see locked in. I want us to be increasing our consumption and use of hardwoods. I think the main message I'm trying to convey with this is these are complementary. These are two different sets of markets largely we're working with, and we need to be able to think about future wood use and availability in that context. Markets are growing, especially in construction, but as I pointed out, softwood supply is set to fall. Those are the volume markets. Modern forestry practice locks up more carbon, also supports more biodiversity, so this is not a trade-off scenario we're looking for. And finally, as I said, those markets are complementary, not interchangeable. And we're not going to replace our softwood markets with a greater hardwood supply any century soon. So let's look at how we can grow both of them in tandem. Okay, so that's me. Thank you very much for listening. I'm now going to hand over to Tom. So hopefully, Tom, you're ready to share your screen, and we move on to the next presentation. I will stop sharing.
Just while Tom's setting up there, I'm just going to say if anybody's got any questions based on what Stuart said or what Tom's going to say, just pop those questions into the box. And particularly if there are any parliamentarians who are keen to ask a question, you will get the priority. Just put a note in the box saying you want to speak. I'll now leave you with Tom, who's sharing well. Thanks, Tom.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. As introduced, I'm Tom Barnes, Managing Director of Aston Timber. The last time I presented to you, I talked about the benefits of using homegrown timber and why tree planting alone will not provide the benefits that we desire. This time I'm going to talk to you about hardwoods and the specialty softwood market, the extent of it, the part homegrown plays, and what I think the future holds. I will also urge you to ensure that we plant trees with purpose and set out a national timber strategy to provide the renewable and low carbon raw material that we'll need in the future. We import approximately 500,000 cubic meters of hardwoods each year. Our biggest supplier is the US, and the purchase value of this wood is about 400 million cubic meters, 400 million pounds. To put that into context, we import about 6.5 million cubic meters of softwood, and the total global sawn production of hardwoods is 500 million cubic meters. In the UK, we produce approximately 30,000 cubic meters of sawn hardwood timber, and that comes from about 76,000 green tons of hardwood logs. And that accounts for about 7% of the total hardwoods used in the UK. And to put that into context, which Stuart has actually already done, about 10 times as much goes into wood fuel. Now, we can talk another time about why so much goes into wood fuel, but I can tell you the main reason is due to the quality of the timber. Now, I was asked to talk about my ambitions for the hardwood market in the UK. But I'm going to be a little bit morose and say there isn't much room for ambition. We simply don't have the quantity or quality of standing hardwood timber for too much ambition. We have relatively little broadleaf and mixed woodland, and only a small proportion of that is commercially viable. Now, we can do better with what we have, for sure. But believe me when I say there is no big untapped resource out there at the moment. Now, I do have a lot of frustration because we are embarking on an exciting bio-based revolution with wood due to play the starring role. As a country, we're making bold pledges to cut emissions, and 11% of those emissions come from the production and installation of building products. Wood is an obvious replacement, and there's some pictures I'm showing you here of British hardwood. It's actually poplar that has been thermally modified for cladding. And it's the obvious replacement for carbon intensive and non-renewable building materials. but we simply don't have much of it. We haven't taken forestry in England seriously for at least 40 years. Now, you've listened to enough of these presentations to have heard most of what I've said already, but you won't know about the bit I'm going to tell you now. What I'm going to tell you is not based on future predictions of gloom or hope. It's based on what's happening on the ground right now in my industry. Up until now, we've been able to import about 70% of the hardwood and timber generally that we use, and about 90% of the hardwoods we use without too much trouble. And remember, we are the second biggest importer of timber behind China. But then some stuff happened. The US is in the middle of a building boom. And remember, they are our largest supplier of hardwoods. The US lumber futures market has risen from $300 to $1,300 per 1,000 board feet in the last year. Australia's having a building boom. China's having a building boom. In plenty of the supply countries, the amount that's being felled is actually reduced due to pest, disease, fires, and historic overcutting. Freight rates from Asia have quadrupled in 6 months. And that's just some of the highlights. The timber taps are turning off. And here's a few real examples of the effects of that. Danza, which is a very large importing company, big timber company around the world, normally imports 800 cubic meters of sapele per month. That's down to 400. Timber Connections, another big timber importing company in the UK, normally stocks 400 cubic meters of 27mm American white oak. That's a staple in this country. That's down to 60 cubic meters. Most American hardwoods are almost impossible to get hold of. Canadian red cedar, another staple, is almost impossible to get hold of. And prices are rising rapidly as shortages bite. Now, some of the specific drivers I've mentioned will ease for sure, but the macro trends that underpin them are going to make it tougher for a country like ours that relies on importing 70% of its timber. Let's think more generally about timber, because in reality, as Stuart said, I think it's a false dichotomy to talk about hardwoods and softwoods separately, or conifers and broadleaf separately. So looking forward, here are some predictions for the future. GDP is due to grow by 130% by 2050. Building stock to keep up with it is due to double by 2060. And the effect of this is that timber consumption is predicted to rise by at least 170% by 2050. There are other predictions that say it's going to triple by then. Now, the latter, timber consumption, is believed to be driven by urbanization, housing demand, and decarbonisation. And that last figure takes us from about 2.2 billion cubic meters of roundwood to about 5.8 billion cubic meters by 2050. That's logs. However, by 2050, the available volumes of roundwood will be in the region of 3.7 to 4.7 billion cubic meters, which means that between now and then, demand and supply are going to part company. In other words, between now and 2050, it will become ever scarcer. Countries that have it will undoubtedly want to hold on to it. So we have a problem, and I'm afraid to tell you that that problem is baked in for the next 40 years. So I put it to you that the severity of this situation is similar to that which we faced after the Great War. Timber is an essential commodity, and it is in increasingly short supply. So what we need is a national timber strategy similar to that of 1919 when the Forestry Commission was created. The Forestry Commission was established to undertake a tree planting mission of truly epic scale. So fast forward by 102 years, and we have the 6th carbon budget by the Committee for Climate Change, which talks about scaling up afforestation to 30,000 hectares by 2025 and then 50,000 hectares by 2035. This is another truly epic effort. But this ambition gives us scale, but it says nothing about the quality of planting, ongoing management, or the usefulness of woodlands, forests, and the timber resource in the future. So this epic challenge calls, I think, for the next national timber strategy. In my view, a strategy that replaces this current paralysis, that acknowledges the scale of the challenge, takes responsibility for producing renewable and clean building products and plastic replacements of the future, lays down a timber crop for 2060 onwards, includes native hardwoods, naturalized hardwoods, valuable conifers such as cedar and Douglas fir, productive areas of spruce and pine, as well as maybe some experimental species, but insists on selected seed and ongoing management. If we are going to plant all of these trees, which the government has dedicated themselves to, let's not waste this opportunity. I urge you to ensure that we plant with purpose and we set out with a strategy and provide the raw material for ambition of the future. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much indeed there, Tom. Really laying down the kind of scale of the challenge there. I'll hand over now to Baroness Young. Baroness Young, you said at the last meeting that hardwoods needed to be seen for their productive potential, not just as carbon sinks and wildlife habitats. Can you tell us a bit more about your thinking on planting hardwoods with a productive purpose, and maybe reflect a little on what both Stuart and Tom have said?
Thank you. I should give a disclaimer and say that this is not official Woodland Trust policy yet, but we are having discussions about some of these heartbreaking statistics that you've heard. 80% of the hardwood timber we use is imported. We've just done our report on the state of woods and trees that showed that only 7% of native woodlands are in good condition. Over half of all woodland species of biodiversity in decline, despite the increase in woodland cover. Now, the government's ostensibly committed to planting many more trees as part of the zero carbon push, and also an initiative to drive more off-site construction for a range of issues to do with safety and cost and quality. And they're looking to see an increased emphasis on timber-based construction to reduce reliance on high-energy carbon-based materials like concrete and steel and plastic. So I think there's a real opportunity here for a sort of win-win virtuous circle where we import less wood and are less reliant on the global market, which, as Thomas said, is challenging, where we can boost jobs, where we can improve native woodland condition through supporting a sustainable UK hardwood industry. And so I've got a sort of 5-point plan for things that I would like to see happen. First of all, we need to get some work going whereby commercial planting and conservation planting examine how they go about creating woodlands and try to maximize the benefits for both commercial income and biodiversity improvement and carbon sequestration, coming at it from opposite directions clearly, but having some common ground that there needs to be multi-purpose forestry, and let's just try that out and see whether you can actually achieve these multi-purpose woods. Now, Stuart mentioned Doddington, which is an example. I've been up to see many woods in Scotland where increasingly there is a much greater range of objectives being achieved by these new forests. I'm not saying that it can work. What I'd like to see is it explored with much more vigour. The second thing that I think the government should do is that it should lay down some requirements for government construction procurement. If you think about all of the construction projects that government pays for, major, and yet there is no requirement to start to see a greater use of UK hardwood and softwood timber being used over time. I think governments need to do that to help create the market. Meantime, we've got to work with government to sort out the kind of lack of clarity facing the domestic wood fuel industry. We must not let carbon mean that everyone runs scared of domestic wood fuel industry. The third thing I want is that we are going to eventually get a national tree plan. It keeps on saying it's in the next few weeks, but it's been in the next few weeks for the last 6 months, so it'd be quite nice if it was in the next few weeks. And I would like to see incentives within that for the management of both current and future native broadleaf woods, because at the moment there is absolutely no incentive for these woods to be given effective management, and we cannot move ahead with a major tree planting exercise that involves substantial amounts of native broadleaf wood without ensuring that they will be effectively managed for the future. And I would like to see at least a substantial proportion of them managed in a way that allows a commercial timber crop to be taken. I think Tom's idea of a national timber strategy is a good one, but let's not make it just a national timber strategy. Let's make it a productive woodland strategy, which is producing a whole range of benefits: biodiversity, carbon reduction, as well as competitive markets within the UK, competitive uses of timber, and also some incentives for the sawmill industry to retool to take advantage of that over time. My last point is the public forest estate. The public forest estate is by far the biggest single supplier of timber to the domestic market, and it's got a key role in shaping that market for nature, for carbon, and for business benefit. And so we've really got to have some stern discussions about what the public forest estate is going to be about for the future. And that links also with the key role of the Forestry Commission as the regulator, not just a regulator for the forest industry, but a regulator to get these multi-purpose forests maximising their benefits for all three areas: carbon, biodiversity, and timber production. So what I would like to see is this being worked up, because the transition, as Tom said, will take decades, and we've got to start now. And I look forward, I hope, to working with all of you on working this up to see what the art of the possible is. But if we don't start now, we'll never start. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Barbara. Just to come back on one of the points you made there, first of all, when you talked about visiting Doddington and some of the forests in Scotland that are doing, I think what you hinted at was that they're doing more. They're looking at more objectives than timber production, but they're not looking at the broad range that you would aspire to. What does that common ground and those delivering those multiple objectives, what does it look like in your head? You know, how can you see it working?
I think that's where we need to do a bit of work on looking at both the planting that will be envisaged as part of the nature-based solutions to climate change and the whole carbon issue, and making sure that we don't have one set of forests that are for carbon and one set of forests that are for timber production. We've got to have some forests, at least explore whether we can have forests that are going to fulfill a range of objectives, including biodiversity restoration. So I think we're a million miles away yet from understanding what that would look like. But, you know, the Doddingtons are a beginning, though they are not looked at in the context of having a hardwood crop. Most of the native broadleaf planting on commercial estates are still very much seen as something you've got to do in order to get the licenses to plant the commercial stuff. I would quite like the challenge to be laid down that says, okay, then let's look at multi-purpose forestry that is going to provide a crop of biodiversity, a crop of carbon reduction, a crop of softwood, and a crop of hardwood. And what would that look like? And that's the challenge that I think we've got to now explore and see whether we can go further than the Doddingtons, so that it's not just the softwoods that are seen as the commercial crop, but the hardwoods as well.
Just a final question, Barbara, before we move on. I think it's probably from Stuart's perspective, and you've had a lot of conversation with Stuart. It's very encouraging to hear you, you know, being very open-minded about the balance of the two. But there are strong environmental voices that just do not countenance productive forestry at all. They're still turning their sort of back to it. How do we sort of open up that conversation with those who are not engaging at all with the need for timber, and talking environmentalism while being prepared to import 80% of the wood that this country uses? How do we bring them into the conversation meaningfully?
I think the difficulty has been, over the last 40 years, right from the Flow Country onwards, really, we've been in our bunkers. The commercial folk have been in their bunker and the conservationists have been in their bunker. And I would like now there to be some sort of no man's land in the middle where we can play football on Christmas Day, and see if we can get some solutions, some demonstrations going that actually prove the point that you can do both. Now, I may be being over optimistic. People will say, oh, you'll never do it because the squirrels will wreck it. Well, we're getting somewhere with squirrel control. We can get somewhere with deer control. And the reality is, unless we try to produce some of these solutions, we'll constantly be back in the bunkers. And I just think it's become very unhealthy.
Okay. Stuart, just initially a reflection on what Baroness Young said there, and also just a question from Geraint Davis, MP, who's saying hardwoods, we are burning too many hardwoods, and that is the big challenge, that we need to move more hardwoods into higher value than burning it. I wonder if you have any particular comments on that, and then maybe Tom has some comments on that question as well.
Thanks, David. Yeah, I mean, very simply, welcome what Barbara's saying, and very supportive of what Barbara's saying. I think we visited Donington together, and what's really interesting, the point you're saying there, I mean, this is how we can see multi-purpose forestry paid for by Softwood. How can we now have multi-purpose forestry paid for by productive hardwoods? And absolutely, I think there is the opportunity to do that. And a big stepping stone of that will be, as you say, the new tree strategy, the action plan, and how that facilitates us to be able to look at a joined up approach. I mean, in terms of the question about, we're burning so much hardwoods, and how can we change that? I mean, definitely, if we can put more hardwoods into markets like construction, obviously that's going to deliver higher benefits in terms of carbon. It also creates more jobs, because you're creating jobs through a supply chain and not into a simple market. I mean, the challenge at the moment is that the hardwood market is really the only market there. Sorry, the wood fuel market is really the only market there at the moment for a lot of the hardwoods that we grow. So we need to take the actions that Barbara said in terms of helping to support increase markets for hardwood. The UK government, Zach Goldsmith, is interested in that, so we need to see more of that happening through the strategy. Tom made the point that quality is a big issue, and both Tom and Barbara mentioned the thorny issue of squirrels, and deer. So we've got to do something about that. But again, very much agree with Barbara's point of view, which is, let's do something about it. Let's take action, and there are actions that we can take. For example, on the grey squirrels, we're looking at various technologies which could help us to control squirrels, and we need to do more on that in terms of investment and supporting that to come through. And if we take these different actions together, then we can start to, as far as I'm concerned, significantly shift the dial into establishing successfully quality multi-purpose hardwoods, which then support high quality jobs and take carbon out of the atmosphere.
Okay, Tom, do you want to come in on that point that we're just using too many hardwoods?
I would. I mean, the simple answer is we don't burn hardwood if it's any good for anything else. That's the end of the line for hardwood. So it's either going to be thinnings, which will be too small, or the quality is just too poor, and that's a big part of the problem. See, because our hardwood forestry is not being serious. It's a bit of we're sort of hit and hope. It's down to luck. So you couple that with ash dieback, couple that with squirrels, and a lot of what is felled is just not good enough to use for anything else apart from wood fuel. So that's the first thing. It is a market. If it was worth more and could fetch more as another product, it would be sold as that.
So does that come back that come back to management, Tom? Does that come back to active management?
It comes back to a whole bunch of things. It comes back to management. It comes back to the quality of the seed that was put in there, and it comes back actually in the hardwood sector to years of taking out the best of the crop and leaving the worst behind. And so we've been slowly denuding the quality of our broadleaf woodlands. In terms of timber, I mean, Barbara would see it slightly differently, but in terms of timber, we've been denuding the quality over years. Now, what I was going to mention is that there's a very good model for commercial hardwood forestry just over the water in France. If you look at the way that they manage their oak forests as a crop. Now, to do that, you have to have time horizons in terms of 100 years, 200 years. You can't be looking at it in terms of tens of years. So they have a very good model over there for cropping of oak, where they will go in periods of 40 years and they will take out each time the worst crop. And so what they're left with at the end is genetically the best oak crop. And from there, they will then replant with those acorns and start all over again. So there is a model for doing it. Now, I know land ownership in France is very different to what it is here. They had a good revolution out there which put land in the hands of the public estate, which we don't have to such an extent here. But I think we could do worse than look at how the French do it, just to at least convince ourselves that there is a model for commercial hardwood forestry.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Lord Carrington, can I bring you in to ask your question, please?
Thank you very much, Ben. My question is one that I come back to time and time again, and that is that all of this depends on financial resources, and there is no sign of those financial resources coming to us. I, for the last 50 years, have been maintaining growing hardwoods in the south of England, but I've never made a penny out of any of it. The finance has come from grants and other things, but I've never made any money. So how are you ever going to attract people to grow and maintain woodland without putting in the financial incentives to encourage them?
Good question. Stuart or Barbara or Tom, anyone just jump in here?
Could I have a go? Because the Woodland Trust must be, over the last 30, 40, 50 years, has been the organisation that has planted probably the most native broadleaf with the least amount of financial support other than through donors. All of a sudden, the whole carbon market has changed all that, because the reality is there is money around now that is being used to create nature-based solutions and to meet the UK commitment to progress towards net zero. And so if ever there was any money that might make this a possibility, it is now. And that's why I think the time has come for us to look at how we could achieve this multi-purpose forestry, because there will be also incentives for biodiversity improvement. So if public money for public goods has got any force to it, we would want to see government investment very much trying to focus on how do you maximize the benefit of the public buck. And the public buck is aimed at carbon reduction, biodiversity improvement, and support to native grown home produced timber to make us less reliant on imports. And if we could get those three things, I think there would be substantially more money in the system than there's ever been before. And so the time to have a go at this is now, in my view.
Stuart, how can we start things moving in the right direction, Stuart, in terms of incentives, in terms of policy? And do you think that the England Tree Action Plan, which is due to be out at the end of May, we are assured it is going to be out at the end of May, how could that point us in the right direction and start doing the sort of things that Lord Carrington says to give that practical support?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of elements to what we talked about just there. And I mean, one of the positive things, as far as I'm concerned, is there are a number of opportunities that we can look at. It's wonderful there was a silver bullet, we just did this one thing and then it would work. But we're not. We're looking at a number of different things here. has been set out by the speakers and also in the chat box. We've got to make sure that we deal with these strategic issues of squirrels and deer, and then we need to make sure that we incentivize people to not just establish but manage those woodlands, and then those woodlands that we have got which are in poor condition, how can we then bring them into better condition? And I do think there's an opportunity there. There's certainly the charitable route. There's an interest in that now. We're starting to see markets being created. It isn't just about producing wood to harvest to go into a building, but it's also about supporting and delivering biodiversity. If we can produce or manage our woodlands well, they've got higher biodiversity, there's potential for a higher carbon benefit. So those are the kind of things that government's looking to facilitate means in which that funding can be brought in. And there are better minds than I have out there who are looking at how investment can come in for the point of managing or creating woodlands to produce wood. And I'd be interested to see how that can then be extended to hardwood. And one other point, and I know I'm throwing a lot of things, it feels like I'm throwing darts at a dartboard here. You've got Dan Ridley-Ellis there and some others making the point about using this wood in innovative ways. Tom's been doing some fantastic stuff at Baston. These are things that we didn't consider or look at 30 or 40 years ago, but which we can now. And that then comes on to the point that you're saying, Dave, teeing up the England Tree Action Plan. We really need that England Tree Action Plan to say, yeah, how do we just start to change this now? Let's not just go head in the sand. It's all so terrible. It's such a big challenge. Let's not do something about it. Let's actually, yes, let's do something about it. And I think we can make a difference. So it's, we need the tree action plan, and then we need government to be working with us in the way we've done here to say, let's deliver these solutions.
Yeah, just very briefly, Stuart, there's a number of questions about continuous cover forestry at CCF and whether there should be less clear fell and more, CCF should be a bigger part of the solution. Brief comments on that, please.
Well, it's a very interesting, intelligent question. I sort of think what we should be looking at in the same way we've said, it's not about softwoods and hardwoods, conifers and broadleaves. It's about how can we work in a way which allows us to deliver good quality outcomes. With silvicultural regimes, I'm not a big fan of saying this is the silvicultural regime we should follow and then let's work back to how we make it happen. One of the things that was a big salutary lesson for me was when I used to work for the Forestry Commission, and I was involved in developing the UK Woodland Assurance Standard. And the RSPB and some other NGOs, for example, were very, very determined that we should not actually have clear felling. And they fought very hard to almost reduce it as an option, take it out as an option. And then the RSPB came back to me 3 years later and said, well, actually, rather sheepishly, we realised that clear felling is vital to support recovery of our nightjar and woodlark populations. And I think, again, it's just, always get very nervous when people talk about an outcome as the way to then work back to what we actually do. I think we've got to identify what we want to achieve from the woodlands that we manage. How can we allow that to happen? We work on the basis of evidence, and we work with people who want to manage those and to deliver those multi-purpose forests that there. And that can be different types of management regimes, and we've got room for that in the UK.
Yeah, okay. Barbara, do you want to come in there?
I mean, I want to really link that with something in the chat that's in the chat about how do we get the research going for what we might use the existing hardwood, the inadequate poor quality hardwood for, and also to address Geraint's worries about burning hardwood, because it does seem to me that we need to look at what the current timber crop that we could have from existing hardwoods by way of thinnings and restructuring and doing the French thing might be able to be used for the future. Get that product development end of the market really beginning to come through. and being absolutely clear about it, that that's something that it's appropriate for government to subsidise. I mean, that sort of market-making research has been subsidised by government for aeons in the agricultural field. We now need to see that in the forestry field. But we've got to be absolutely clear about what the outcomes are that we want to achieve, about what the things are we want to achieve through multi-purpose forestry, so that we don't find that one or other of the competing interests is getting the upper hand, because then we'll all start getting back in the bunker again. Okay,
Tom, you wanted to come in. If you can keep it fairly brief, please.
Very brief. I just wanted to, one thing in response to Lord Carrington and how to make forestry pay, I just wanted to make the point that wood values are rising rapidly now, and they will continue to do in the future. And as wood shortages bite, I think the value of timber will rise very sharply. So I think, you know, let's be positive about what it could be as a crop in the future.
Okay, we are coming to time, and just like for a brief comment on, we all know COP26 is happening at the end of this year. What are the big high level messages that the forestry and wood industry should trying to sell on a global scale? You know, what messages should they be taking to, you know, the global community, not just the UK government, to say forestry and wood really matters here? We want to break down those kind of barriers. We want to get away from that binary approach. What are the big overall messages? Barbara, Stuart, then Tom, briefly, please.
For me, the biggest overall message is let's have some sort of land use strategy, because the reality is trees need to grow on land. Land is not increasing. There's nothing you can do to make more land on this globe, short of draining the seas. And to be frank, we've got to make sure that the land that's available is used in the most effective way. And that, for me, is the big message that COP26 needs to grasp.
Stuart?
Two things in that context, that global context. I mean, clearly, we need to stop deforestation overseas as part of the means of achieving our carbon targets. And not only part of that deforestation is taking place as a result of demand for wood. Most of it is other reasons, but there is related to demand for wood. So therefore, we've got a responsibility to take on board that we produce more here, both hardwood and softwood. I think the other thing is we've got to move on from setting targets to delivering against those targets. And one thing that we're pushing very hard for at COP26 is for Zach Goldsmith to be working with the other countries to say, yeah, we're each going to take a share of this target that we've set, and we know it's going to cost. So here's the funding. We're going to put it in place and we're going to make it happen.
Okay, Tom, brief final comment from you.
Back that up, I would say start now. Let's stop making plans and setting targets. You know, we made some years ago now plans for 30,000 hectares a year, and we're not achieving any of that. We're still talking about the future, where, you know, if you read the 6th carbon budget, it makes it quite clear that if we want to achieve any of our goals for 2030, 2050, we have to be doing dramatic things right now.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Again, I'm really sorry. Loads of great comments in the box. We can share those comments with you afterwards. Lots of great questions we couldn't get through. We know we're scratching the surface here, but we are trying to do our best to try to bring different elements of the discussion together. And hopefully, with Stuart and Tom and Barbara today, we have shown that there is some real interest in moving towards that broader perspective. Thanks very much for everybody who came, and I'll just ask Ben to say a few final words before we.
Thanks, David, and just to echo your thanks really to Barbara, Tom and Stuart for their insightful contributions, and to all of you who have been able to tune in with us this afternoon. We'll meet again towards the end of June, probably on the 23rd or the 30th of June, by which time we'll have lots more to discuss. The England Tree Action Plan will have been published by then. We'll also have the 2020-21 tree planting figures, and of course the implications of the election results in Scotland and Wales. So there'll be plenty of us to get our teeth into there. We're also thinking longer term to when we might be able to meet again in person, possibly around October time. And I know Confer is looking at options. So watch this space and look out for the next APPG newsletter update. I'm looking forward very much to another exciting year as the chair of this APPG, as we continue to push the importance of forestry and wood in the year of COP26. as was discussed there at the very end. And thank you again to everybody who's taken part in holding this meeting today. And I hope to see you all again in June. Diolch yn fawr.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Ben. All the best.
All the best. Thanks, David.
Bye.